Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Therese and Dr. Mara, and we're back to talk about the amygdala today and to share some thoughts on how that works. And we'd like to also talk about a new venture we have called Umoja. So, Mara, I'd love for you to begin and talk to us about Together We Rise and our wellness insights.
Okay, thanks, Therese. Well, Therese and I have known each other for, 5 years now, I think it's been, and we originally met at one of my nonprofit meetings for my organization called LIFE, which stands for Living in Fulfilled Enlightenment. Basically, the mission and purpose of me starting LIFE was to support our community by providing education and well-being support. I originally started by hosting monthly meetings on various wellness topics to kind of introduce new, different topics to our community members, but also to really get people thinking in a different way. And that's when I met Therese, because she came to the group and introduced Heart Math and talked to us about the M-Wave program and basically she taught us how to self-regulate. Since then, we've become good friends and realized that we have a lot of similar joint efforts and ideas for the world and ways that we can contribute to the world to hopefully make it a better place and help people deal with the daily life stressors. And as a result, basically, we've been doing some work and some podcasts, and together we came up with Umoja, which is our joint venture coming together. And our initial intention for this was, behind the thought of bringing the community together during this pandemic and difficult times, we thought that together we could rise. And we have seen the positive outcomes of all of these tragedies and the collective humanity of people coming together, supporting each other. And we thought that this was a perfect opportunity for us to introduce our wellness insights. What we hope to do with this collective venture is to be able to offer support during times of crises, because we know, and through our personal experience, we've learned that this is life. This is what happens. There will always be stressors. There will always be positive ways in which you can deal with these stressors and positive coping mechanisms. So we really hope to add this positive spin to the crazy, chaotic world we're experiencing today and will continue to experience. And hopefully we can teach this to our children and teach these adaptive modalities to our children so that they can grow up having less stress and having better coping skills than some of us were given as children.
Right. And I think this really has given us a great opportunity to actually sit and be able to think a while and figure out what's best. And watching this chaos happening with the police and the protests really show us how important emotional self-regulation is. And we feel that the more you learn about it, the better off you'll be, such as, our topic today, which is how the brain is working and how it could be hijacking what we really want, but how we can also change that, right? And make it better for all of us and understand that connection. So Mara, what are some of the other things that you're doing in addition to life that is helping with this cause?
Well, it's interesting, as we talked before with the pandemic, it really is forcing people, businesses, communities to think outside the box and to kind of evolve in what they're doing. And initially I started hosting monthly meetings at my house with a speaker and trying to bring our community together and to remind people that you're not alone and you're experiencing things that other people are experiencing, and some maybe just are not telling you or not able to be vulnerable enough to share that with you. So originally what we were trying to do is provide this community, provide the support with different topics and education along the way. And then of course with the pandemic that changed because we haven't been able to get together in larger groups. Therefore, where I felt my heart was and still is, and where I could probably provide the best support is to the frontline workers and the healthcare heroes. Obviously, being an emergency medicine physician, I have a lot of passion for the people that are on the front line right now and all the essential workers. Therefore, we have focused our efforts on trying to support their well-being. And in doing this, we've been pairing with local businesses and restaurants to provide meals for the staff. We have been kind of communicating with our community, asking for donations for PPE gear. We've had a lot of community members step up and start to make their own surgical masks and surgical caps to help support. I even bought a sewing machine and learned how to sew myself. So there are a lot of ways that people are evolving, adapting, and changing, but coming together to really support the community. And I think that's what's going to be so important out of all of this, if we can remember that, yes, there are tragic things that happen in life, but it's the way that we handle them and deal with them that defines our character and really our humanity and can bring us all together. Now, what I've been working on with you is to provide the emotional support for the frontline heroes, essential workers, and really the global community, because we're going to have a lot of people having post-traumatic stress and getting their amygdalas hijacked. I mean, obviously, we're seeing that around the world globally right now. So I think where we can offer that support and what Umoja's mission is to really be able to support the world so that we can learn different ways of coping and positive strategies that can propel us forward.
Yeah, agree. And I've been working with, yesterday was on a global panel dealing with children who learn differently because they're our future. And like Mara mentioned before, we need to teach the children these aspects of emotion and how powerful they are and how they can help them. And so that also is adding to all of this, to just try to get people together. And everybody's looking for help all around the world. And so this is why these messages are so important. So how about if we begin on the amygdala today? And we'll start. Did you want me to start the video now?
Well, I want to say something. I really love the work that you're doing with children. And I hope that you continue to do that, because I just had a conversation with a friend the other day where, when you look at all the tragedies that are going on right now in the world, and you think of the difference of, whether it's the color of your skin or, the language you speak, whatever differences they are, I think our children right now are the next generation that doesn't see the world that way. I know when I speak of this, I mean, I'm mainly talking about my children, but they really don't see the difference between skin. They don't see black or white. They see all these different gray zones and how we all blend together. And I really think it's an important time to work with our children, because I think they will be the generation that changes the world and sees it differently. And this is the time for that. So I think it's great that you're doing that work.
Thank you. And I think too, what I love about it is, we had a conversation and they were talking about, for these children that learn differently, to get a safe room or a sensory room. And so what was brought up from this woman from India, she says, well, you people in the US have large homes. We live in a very small home. It's very hard to set up a sensory area where somebody can go. And I thought, wow, these are the kind of things, Mara, that help us to learn how to deal with things differently. This is how we share information from, doctors, right? You're listening to doctors from Australia, from all these different countries, to get the best thing to do with this virus at the moment, right? And you're constantly updating that. Well, this is what we need to do. We need to connect as a global society, as humanity. And this is our chance. So we all have this one challenge of the virus. Now I see we have the challenge of the children with learning disabilities, right? So how do we change that? So we have these challenges that we can work together as as all of humanity, which I think is so exciting. I think we have such a great opportunity here.
I agree, Teresa. You know, and I had this conversation with another friend over the weekend. You know, perhaps that's why we have such high autism levels and dyslexia, and because we need people who can see the world differently and come up with different solutions. And I think it's a positive thing. I really hate when I hear kids getting labeled, or, you know, even children with ADHD. I mean, everything, this diversity and all these differences are going to be what unites us, and they are the generation to do that.
They are, and what's so wonderful is they're all gifted in these different areas.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, our education is a little bit behind our educational system, and we're seeing that now because now these children are at home. So we have children that are in school, breaking down, losing it, can't handle it, but then they're at home and they're okay. And the parents
Right.
are learning more, and so we as parents have more time. I know it can be frustrating, but we have more time to learn about the children. And I believe you're right. These kids coming in with these labels, the labels help to get them what they need. But I mean, for years they've said dyslexic can't read. One of my colleagues gets dyslexic children labeled dyslexic to read with no problem. It takes time, and it takes totally different learning, a way to teach them to learn, and they're as successful as anyone else. So we're getting to see this now. Okay, it's not just dyslexic, you'll never read. It's dyslexic, you need to learn this way. It's ADHD, you need this. So it's just a wonderful thing all the way around.
And it kind of, you know, has a little bit, ties in with what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about the hijacked amygdala. And what is that? What does it mean? And how can you offset it? And how can you strengthen your brain so that your amygdala doesn't get hijacked? Since I am an audiovisual learner, we're going to start with a video just to kind of lay the platform down for what we're going to discuss.
Okay, can you briefly, and I don't want to put you on the spot, we didn't discuss this, but explain the amygdala a bit, can you?
Well, I will go into that. I'm going to go into that explanation.
Right.
And this is the purpose of the video, so you'll see.
Super, okay.
When customers are dissatisfied with your service, their feelings can run high. They may have emotional outbursts which seem impossible to deal with. Understanding why people have emotional outbursts can help us control them. Put simply, the amygdala is the emotional center of the brain and the cortex is the thinking area. In particularly stressful or intense situations, the amygdala takes over the cortex, preparing us for fight or flight, and it makes it difficult for us to use intelligence or reasoning. This is known as the amygdala hijack. During an amygdala hijack, adrenaline is released and stays in the body for about 18 minutes. Here's an example of the amygdala hijack in action. The amygdala hijack is characterized by three signs: a strong emotional reaction, a sudden onset, and regretting your actions later. Any strong emotion can trip off the amygdala and impair the cortex's working memory. Rationality is overwhelmed by emotions. Clearly.
Okay, you can stop it now. Thank you. Okay, I wasn't going to, go into that too much further, but so basically,
Perfect.
when we talk about the amygdala in the brain, we have to kind of go over the evolution of it. The brain evolved from the bottom up, which is why our natural response is more of what people refer to as the reptilian brain response. That's our emotional, animalistic response. And it wasn't until evolution occurred that we developed more of a mammalian brain, which has a frontal level cortex. It's a prefrontal cortex, and the higher level of thinking, the executive function centers, which allows us for logical thinking and integration of facts through knowledge. So where the amygdala lies is in the center of the brain. And it's interesting because the brain really is this elegant machine for survival. Mammalians needed to have a brain that registered emotion. And so that's really what kind of sets us above from as mammals. And it's through evolution that emotions have become a primary function of survival for us. So the amygdala is really in the center of the brain, and everything that we see that enters our brain goes through the amygdala. So the amygdala is kind of like the center that is filtering through information to decide for us, is this a threat? And so when originally the amygdala was probably created in our brain through evolution to save us and to keep us safe and to keep us alive, because, you know, thousands of years ago, it was really came to a matter of be eaten, either kill or be killed kind of a situation. So we needed the amygdala to sense our threat, and that's what it does. It senses the threat. And it will actually keep us safe. It will tell us when there is a threat. And so the problem that happened with evolution really is the amygdala never really calmed down. And it's interesting when you read about it, children who grow up in a very stressful environment or abusive environment actually grow a bigger amygdala. And it's likely because they're in a threatening environment and threatening situation. So they need to be more hypervigilant. They are more constantly in the sympathetic fight or flight mode because they are around chaos. Therefore, what happens with these children is, as adults, they are more anxiety prone. They are more reactive, more emotional. They have a harder time self-regulating and controlling that. And so there's a purpose for it. So basically, the amygdala is the center that decides, is this a threat to me? What do I need to do? How do I need to react? And when it sees a threat, then it sets off the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this is the hormone regulation system in our brain that connects to our adrenal glands and releases all the stress hormones, primarily cortisol. And this sets off the sympathetic nervous system so that we can fight or flight. And this is all a survival mechanism. However, what's happened in our modern day society, where we don't necessarily have these threats of a tiger coming to eat us, we have other threats. We have it could be a threatful email or a text message. It can be a way someone responds to you, somebody not responding to your text messages, somebody ghosting you, those are perceived by our amygdala as life or death threats. So what happens is the amygdala has this disproportionate reaction to the stimulus that is being provided. And so it can tend to overreact. And then when this HPA axis gets fired and initiated, we can no longer use our prefrontal cortex, and therefore we lose our higher level of thinking, the executive function, we lose our logic, and we just go into this reactive emotional state, which your brain really believes is truly life or death. And it's trying to save you. But in doing this, unfortunately, it is causing a cascade of stressful hormones and events that are increasing your heart rate, increasing your blood pressure, hijacking you so that you can't use your logic and reasoning. So as you can see in our world, this can become very maladaptive, and we're seeing this all over the news. And, you know, these are the people rioting and breaking into buildings and looting, and they're just in this reactive state. And for them, it's real. It's real. I see it in the emergency department all the time. These people, it is a matter of life or death, and that's what they're fighting for. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of this is fear-based. These chemicals, that video talks about the chemicals and cortisol that's released. It can last for 18 minutes, but it can also last in your body and surge in your body for 4 hours. This is also why you can have a I always call it as cortisol hangover, you know, because these chemicals are released and then later you're just exhausted and spent and you can't figure out why. Well, it's because of all of these hormones and cortisol basically. But how to know, I guess what I should talk about is how do you know if your amygdala is being hijacked? I think now we talked enough about the neurophysiology behind it and evolution of it. But how do you know? Like I said, it could be just a simple little stimulus that sets off this disproportionate response. So number one, it's usually whenever you have a strong emotional support. It's very sudden. I'm sorry, I said a strong emotional response is what I meant. So a strong emotional response, it will be very sudden, and then usually later you regret it. So those are the three indicators that you were hijacked by your amygdala. And keep in mind, go ahead.
I was thinking one more thing. You also may have a physiology response, a physical response of sweaty palms, stomach ache, headache that comes in with all this as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and then actually your pupils even dilate. So yeah, it definitely, there are physiologic components behind it. And the thing is, because of this cascade of hormones and stress chemicals, you may not even know it or realize it until those are finally released or until you're able to get to the parasympathetic nervous system, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today. So I did mention our prefrontal cortex. That's the part of our brain that does the logical thinking. There are ways to tap back into that. Some of the strong emotions that most people feel are fear and anger. And we're seeing a lot of that right now. Fear with the pandemic, anger with the pandemic, because people aren't isolating, people aren't, thinking of others or doing their part. It's the same thing with the rioting and the protesting. Those are very, very strong emotions that many of us humans experience, hopefully not on a daily basis, but some of us do. One interesting thing I want to talk about is another neuroanatomical difference in people that can predispose you to be more fear-based, to get your amygdala hijacked more often, and to be more anxiety prone or depression prone. So there is actually a researcher, by the way, a lot of the information on hijacking the amygdala came from Daniel Goleman. He's a researcher in emotional intelligence and social intelligence. So he actually coined the term hijacked amygdala. There are a lot of YouTube videos if you want to more about it or look into that further. And he has a great book on emotional intelligence that I've read. So I do recommend that. But there was another researcher, Richard Davidson, and what he found when he started to look at why certain people have a higher emotional response, what they looked is they started scanning people's brains, and they did that with MRIs, and then they were able to predict how a person's mood or reaction would be based off the imaging that they found on their MRIs. And what they found is, unfortunately, some people have a ratio. Let me see, I want to make sure I explain this properly to you. When your amygdala gets hijacked, it takes over the right side of your prefrontal cortex, and that is the more emotional side of your brain. So people who get more frequently hijacked by their amygdala tend to have more right-sided dominant activity in their brain on these MRI scans. And when you do that, you tend to have more of a depressed mood, more of an anxious mood, and people are compared to people who use more of the left side of their prefrontal cortex. These individuals, they may get hijacked by their amygdala, but for whatever reason, their brain chemistry allows them to access the left side of the prefrontal cortex more often. And what the left side of the prefrontal cortex does is almost has this inhibitory effect on the amygdala, where it basically tells the amygdala, shut up. I'm not listening to you. I don't care what you're telling me. I know that there's, no reason and logic behind that. And actually these people can shut down the amygdala, and these people tend to have better moods. They tend to be happier most of the time. They tend to have very little anxiety, very little depression. So, it's not all us. It is our genetics sometimes, and the way that our brain functions in these pathways that may have been set up for us as children because of our environment that we grew up in. And so it's really, I felt that to be very fascinating to me because I can relate to that. I grew up in a very stressful environment. I have learned through my research and self work that I probably have a bigger amygdala, and I tend to go to fight or flight mode more often and get hijacked more often. So I've had to learn how to work with that. And I will have down days and high days. And, I will deal with anxiety and having days where I just feel like doing nothing. Whereas my husband is very different. He definitely, and I've always said I'm all right brain. He's all left brain. He just goes to left brain most of the time. And the interesting thing is people who tend to be more left brain dominant during this hijacking actually have more logic, more self-control. I already said happier moods, but they also have more self-confidence. And so it's interesting and fascinating to me to know that there can be a genetic component and obviously an environmental component. But the good thing is to know that there are things that you can do to, number one, get yourself out of this hijacked amygdala mode. And number two, there are things you can do to actually shrink your amygdala and help your brain to shift to the left side so that you can increase your mood and have this be sustainable and permanent. But it does require some practice. So I want to talk about that. Do you have any questions, Therese, about what I talked about?
I think we're going to be close to running out of time, so maybe we can do a series.
I know, right? Okay, well, so I'll just get to what can you do now. So for me, we know a lot of things you can do. We know meditation and mindfulness are great, but I want to know, what can I do right now? What can I do right now that's simple? And the reality is the easier the task, the smaller the task, sometimes the greater the results. So the first thing you can do is honestly count to 10. When you stop and you count to 10, it actually shuts down the amygdala and turns on your prefrontal cortex. So then you can access your executive center functions. You can think more logically, and then you can regain self-control. And then you can also ask yourself, so what I would do is I would take the 10 seconds, and then there's also recommendations if you're really reacting and there's a lot of emotion behind it, 10 seconds may not be enough. You may actually have to count up to 100 to really just shift and kind of get out of that. And obviously, Therese is going to talk about breathing, but any sort of slow, deep breathing will take you out of the parasympathetic nervous system take you out of sympathetic nervous system into parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest mode of our nervous system that allows us to relax and allows us to access our prefrontal cortex. And you can do daily practice of mindfulness and meditation, of course. Research has shown even 2 minutes of doing meditation a day can shrink your amygdala. If you shrink your amygdala, then you're going to have less opportunities to be hijacked by it. You're going to be less reactive, less anxiety prone. I do this. I believe in small little changes. And for me, it's really hard when I started doing work with physicians on wellness, and you try to get them to meditate 20 minutes a day, and you try to do all sorts of things. It's almost too much in this world we live in, Therese. I think it's like telling someone to go to the gym for an hour a day. It's really hard to tie that into your busy schedule. Therefore, what I do is I do before I even get out of bed in the morning, I set my alarm maybe 5 minutes earlier or 10 minutes earlier, depending on what I have going on that day. And when my alarm goes off, I snooze and I take the time and I do my slow, deep, meditative breathing. And I like affirmations. So whatever I need that day, whether it's calm, peace, love, acceptance, whatever it may be, I just think of that word and I think of those things and those thoughts that bring that to me during my 2 to 5 minutes of breathing before I even get up. That way, when I get out of bed in the morning, it's already done. I don't even have to think about it. And sometimes I do it too in between patients. If I have a very stressful shift, when I wash my hands, I will actually slow that process and I will do deep breathing. And nobody knows what I'm doing. They just think I'm washing my hands. You're supposed to, the CDC recommends that you wash your hands for 22 seconds to thoroughly clean them. And I think in this pandemic, that's very important that we're all doing it. So maybe that's something I could offer to you, is to try to do that every time you wash your hands, do that slow, deep breathing. And what I've found for me in between patients, that calms me. It really helps me to be kind of at this like steady state of just calm. So then when I go into the next room, I'm not triggered, I'm not activated. I can be with that patient completely and really hear what they're telling me and access my executive, prefrontal cortex, so I can think logically and hopefully come up with the right diagnoses. But I've found those two things really help me. And of course, if you can meditate and find other mindfulness practices, I think that will help you. And it's important to remember, it is a practice. You do have to do it frequently to get results, because if your brain and your anatomy and your brain is triggered to go to the right and you have a greater amygdala, you will be triggered. And therefore, you do need to find a practice that works for you, that you can commit to and isn't overwhelming.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mara. And you did talk about the breathing, because that's so important. And I'll explain a little bit more as we move forward why that's so important. Because the brain, we want to hook it into the heart. So let's go, and I'll try to get my PowerPoint up to see if we can take a look at this. And I would love, your add-ons to this, Mara. I know we've taught this out before in some of our joint ventures. Let's see.
While you're trying to figure that out, I think that these little practices for the parents out there would be very important to teach the children. And because I think, wow, if I had grown up knowing some of this information, it probably really could have changed things for me. I think as children, they're very intuitive and they will naturally seek out the practices that work for them without even knowing they're doing that, such as journaling or sports. I wonder too if that's a big draw for a lot of kids. I mean, I know sports really helped me growing up and allowed me to get to flow and allowed me to find more peace with what I was dealing with as a child.
Right. And I think you're 100% right. We all, and we take on systems and we take on things and ideas that are going to help us through a particular time, right? And that's your survival mechanism. And it's a really good way to do things, is to come up with a survival technique, what to do. But then what happens later on, maybe it's not so good. And that's where I think some of the hijacking happens, right?
Yes.
So we need to change and realize. And I think one of the biggest things we can do is be perceptive to ourselves and see what's not working for us, right? And then we change it. But I think what we're talking about today is really wrong with you, that you're an awful person or whatever. But these things happen. And once we understand them, then we change it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the hidden processes that affect perception, emotions, and reference patterns. So this is exactly what you've been talking about. When emotions accompany events, our brains encode these as implicit, okay, or unconscious reference patterns. The stronger the emotion, the stronger the imprint. Again, back to our instinctual brain, right? The brain encodes associations such as smells, sounds, and surroundings that are present at the time of the event. So these are things that are in the amygdala, already known. They know what it is. It's okay. This is what happens. But sometimes they're associated with a memory that's no longer needed. Okay? So it encodes associations that were present at the time of that event. And I'll get into that a little more. The hidden processes that affect perception in the amygdala. So it's continually monitoring and comparing the incoming information. All right. So it compares current inputs with the unconscious reference pattern or implicit memories to determine what is familiar and what is not. Okay. Again, Mara was talking to you about what's safe, what's not, what's going to send you into the sympathetic side. When we talk about that, we're talking about the autonomic nervous system. And when Mara and I go out and teach, we teach about the balance in that system. Because the one side is the sympathetic, which is, oh my goodness, we have to run, we have to fight, we have to flee, we have to do something. And then, of course, the opposite side is the parasympathetic. The sympathetic is sending in 1,400 hormones that are making your body want to run and do, and everything, your legs are going to run fast and you're going to move your arms. Or the parasympathetic, which is where we go to sleep, right? So these patterns the memories are to determine familiarity, risk, comfort, and safety. Mara, do you have anything to add?
Nope.
Okay.
Well, yes, I mean, I guess I do. I was actually reading about this the other day too. So you're talking about smells and sounds, and scientists have done this work with animals where they can give them a stimulus, a painful stimulus, and they now know the sight of that when it's coming, and then they can pair it with a sound, and you can be conditioned to recognize. I mean, that's what our amygdala is doing all the time, and that's the problem. If you have a bigger amygdala, you're hyper vigilant, and every sound and everything that seems like a threat is triggering this response.
Right. And your response is part of these breathing techniques that we teach, is to get out of that brain pattern and move down to the heart and sync the heart up with the brain. And why is that? Because they have studied that the heart sends more neurotransmitted messages to the brain than the brain to the heart. So it's very important, once we engage that will calm down that emotion. That is what your breath is doing. That is what, taking a long time to wash your hands, you're calming down that initial emotional charge, which is not warranted at the time, right? Mara?
Yes.
Okay, good. I want to make sure this didn't cut out.
Oh, that's okay.
I can't see you because of this PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
So after the stress response has been triggered and the alarm signal has been sent throughout the body, we can learn to more quickly recognize these unproductive automatic responses and self-regulate them. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the self-regulation of emotion and why it is important. So this person saw a dog. The dog is dangerous. They have pain. We need to avoid it. So this is our body, right? It's in the sympathetic side. It's saying we've got to run away from the dog because this dog is going to bite us. Well, this is a previous experience, okay? This might not be that friendly dog that's walking in front of you. But now, every time you see that friendly dog, you automatically go into fight or flight because of this past memory. So this past memory right now is not serving us, okay? And I think one of the things too I wanted to discuss is the slow track versus the fast track, because they used to think that the memory would come in and it would go through the thalamus and go through the thinking process of saying, no, this is a safe dog, this isn't. But because of the hijack and the emotional hijack that the amygdala does, the thalamus takes it in, says, oh boy, this is a threat, and sends it right down to the amygdala, and then all the hormones come out. So because of emotion, it triggers that response. All right. So when we use these self-regulation techniques, as Mara mentioned, the breath, it helps calm the emotional intensity, and it can help us change the negative perceptions. So it allows the slow track to take over, inhibit the immediate stress response, which over time establishes a new familiar, healthy response pattern, as Mara had mentioned about the patterns we have. So the amygdala will get these patterns, these instinctual things will happen as a protection, but at this point, it's not needed any longer. All right. Any questions, Mara? Anything to add to that?
That sounds good.
Okay. All right. So we have the emotional memory that created an inaccurate perception. You see that? And so it activated all of the stress hormones. All right. In reality, look at the dog. The dog is friendly and won't be a problem, but the brain does not see that. So after the stress response has been triggered and the alarm signal again sent throughout the body, we have to learn how to quickly recognize that this is unproductive. It's an unproductive automatic response and self-regulation. So when we self-regulate this, we can eliminate that response.
You know, Therese, I actually have a childhood experience from this. I was attacked by a dog. It was a German Shepherd dog, and it dragged me around a yard twice by my leg. And I don't know how old I was. I was probably 7 or 8 years old. And I used to be so fearful of dogs because of that. And then obviously, you know, I'm a dog lover now and I have 3. But every day when I see the police dogs, because they're usually German Shepherds, when I see them in the ER and stuff, my brain like tries to do that, but I make myself go up and pet them just to kind of create a new neural pathway to tell my amygdala that it's okay. It's not every German Shepherd I see.
Right. And that takes a lot, Mara, for you to do that. That is not easily attainable. That's how we talk about self-work. Things, when we realize something isn't serving us any longer, it is an inaccurate perception. We need to work at changing that. And that's what your breath does. When you go talk to the dog, helps that. All those things, you're breaking through that known pattern that is no longer accurate, right? Do you agree?
Yes, I do.
Super. Okay, so using self-regulation techniques to calm emotional intensity helps us change the negative automatic perception. It allows us, again, for the slow track to take over and inhibit the stress response, which over time establishes a new familiar and healthy response pattern within the brain. Emotional hijack averted. Okay, so I think today we'll end with, and Mara, do you have any more comments at this point?
Do you think that's what I was doing, is going not on the fast track, but teaching my brain to go on the slow track with the dog?
That's what these studies say. Mm-hmm. So, you know, again, I love to combine everything that lots of people have studied to put together for what's best for me. But it makes a lot of sense because the original brain studies were showing that they think everything goes, you know, through the thalamus and through, and I kind of remember, what is the slow track? I'd have to look that back up again. Okay, so I think the slow track, let's see. It's where it's the neural pathway that cognitive behavioral therapy was based on. So it's sent from the thalamus to the sensory cortex, where it becomes the the conscious image. Okay. The fast track, it goes thalamus directly to the amygdala without going through the sensory cortex. So that's what the difference is. And when it's such a strong emotion, that's when we're triggered into fight or flight. And that's what may be inaccurate at the time. Okay, so that friendly dog, it's inaccurate for you to think you have to run away, but your brain's telling you that, and what are you doing? Flooded with hormones, flooded with adrenaline, cortisol. That's why we get stomach ache, we don't feel well, or afterwards, you've just walked by the dog and now you're exhausted.
Right.
That's what's happened. So we want to go back to the slow track, and that's what you're doing. That's exactly what you're doing. And the body is trying to do that for the homeostasis once you're aware of the fact that it's an inaccurate perception. Okay?
Yep.
All right, so let's end with the quick coherence technique. And again, what we're doing is we're taking that thought process, moving it down to the heart, where we can sync the heart and the brain so there isn't that panic any longer. As Mara mentioned, you can do this in the moment. Nobody needs to know you're doing it. And it's not as much of a diaphragmatic breath as it is breathing through your heart. So you breathe in to the count of 5 and out to the count of 5. And you establish a pattern. And the next step is to bring in a thought of appreciation. For instance, if it were the dog, oh, look how friendly that dog is, or I love my dogs at home. And you keep the breath flowing into the count of 5 and out, and you're going to your heart space. You don't need to go to the diaphragm. And then when you feel you've released that emotional charge, you just can continue on moving on to your next thing. It isn't on the go type of thing. When you practice, like Mara said, you wake up and you do this. You do a breathing technique, you do the positive emotion, you do positive thoughts to yourself. You've just changed that whole environment. You've gotten out of the instinctual brain. You've come down to the heart. You've got to the point where, yes, I can handle this. I can move forward in my day. The more you practice, the more resilient you become. And the more it becomes second nature. So probably now when Mara goes to wash her hands, she's doing it anyways. It's helping her body. Her body's going back into balance. And then she moves forward. So it's a really good thing for us to realize all these steps that we can take in order to change this and make it better. So Mara, do you have anything else to add?
No, that was great. So you just basically recommend that people do it until that emotional charge is gone? Is that what you're...
Well, you do it for what you have the time for. If, it will change when you practice. This will change your system within 1 to 3 minutes. With practice, it's like riding a bike. You have to keep practicing. And Mara, you mentioned that many times. You mentioned the fact that we need to practice. Because as we do that, we're changing the familiar pattern in the brain to be more accurate, right? It's more accurate. It knows when there's a real problem or not. It knows that. So I think that is, one of the thoughts that we just we do it all day long when we don't have an emotional charge. Then when it comes, it's not that big of a deal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. So I think we're good for today. And Mara, do you have any final words?
No, I think it's just important to try to, and it's hard, again, it's a practice to try to catch yourself.
Yeah.
And stop the reactivity. And, I practice it all the time. I think I'm pretty good doing it at work and professionally. Where I struggle is at home, reacting to the kids or reacting to my husband, and really trying to stop and count and use your logic before you react, and trying to really think about, why am I being triggered right now? What emotion is this bringing up? What is it all about? And then if you can kind of stop and see that, then you realize it's not actually about my husband. I'm triggered because it was a familiar event or situation from my childhood that, maybe my father did or said or something, and so really, if you can train yourself through practice to get to that point, you can stop yourself. And then in doing that, I know I've tried for many years doing this and practice it, and then all of a sudden you can see where that trigger's coming from and recognize that it has nothing to do with the current situation. And then you start to recognize that, wow, this is my amygdala, and it's trying to save me and help me, but I don't need that any longer. It's not serving me.
Right. And it's awareness. I think that's the biggest thing. And we've discussed this for years now. It's becoming aware of needing a change, and then finding what aligns with you and what can help you produce that change. Okay, well, great. It was great talking to you. Thanks so much. And we will be back again.
Thank you, Therese.
Thanks, Mara. Have a great day.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.